Past Sins, Chapter 1, Everfree Discovery. Oh, Twilight! I just heard the news! Did those ruffians hurt you? Are you okay? Oh, I just can't imagine what it must have been like. I mean, it was probably similar to when I was ponied out by the Diamond Dogs. Still, it's just not the same as getting taken by other ponies. And I, for one— Rarity! Twilight half shouted. The white unicorn had barreled into the unicorn in a huff, catching Twilight in the middle of reading a book. Spike had been organizing the library shelves, though the baby dragon was quickly distracted by Rarity's arrival. Grinning stupidly, and with a smitten look on his face, Spike waved a claw. "Hi, Rarity." "Good day, Spike," the unicorn said before she turned her attention back to Twilight. "Now, what is it you wanted to say, dear?" "I wanted to tell you to relax," assured Twilight. "I'm fine." "Fine?" Rarity echoed dramatically. "How can you be fine? After such a harrowing ordeal you must be positively petrified. And I heard they had you tied up. Oh, you must have such horrible rope burns." "I'll admit it does hurt a little while they had me tied up, but Nurse Redheart already took a look. It's just a minor irritation that will go away by tomorrow. So, Rarity, believe me when I say I'm fine." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," Twilight replied, her voice betraying her minor annoyance. "I appreciate your concern, but every pony has already been here to check on me." "Every pony? Even Fluttershy?" "She was actually the first." "Oh, and what a horrible friend I must be!" Rarity voiced, putting a hoof to her head with a pained, theatrical expression. "Being the last to arrive to check on you. I would have come earlier, but I was working in my shop all day. I'd only just stopped out to get a late lunch when Rainbow Dash found me and told me everything, and I rushed right over." "Rarity, it's okay." No, it's completely unacceptable. I officially owe you, Twilight Sparkle, a favor." "A what now?" Twilight asked as she cocked an eyebrow. "A favor. Pinkie Pie has her promises, I have my favors. You just come to me if you need anything, and, if I can help, I will do my very best to assist." Rarity paused, glancing anxiously away from Twilight while batting at a few strands of her hair. "Just as long as it doesn't involve excessive amounts of dirt." Twilight giggled a little at Rarity's usual discomfort with dirt. "I'll be sure to keep that in mind, but you don't have to worry about me, Rarity. I'm fine, really, yes. Getting pony napped wasn't exactly how I intended to spend my evening, but everything turned out all right. If anything, I'm just a little annoyed. I've been trying to get some reading done all day, but because every pony coming to check on me, I haven't even gotten past the first page." "Then I shouldn't take another moment of your time. You just read, relax, and recover from your traumatic ordeal," Rarity said as she headed for the door, only to turn back one final time. "And remember, if you need anything, I owe you one favor." "I got it," Twilight replied as she watched her friend leave before finally being able to get into her book. Fluttershy, Pinkie Pie, Applejack, Rainbow Dash, and now Rarity. She had been visited by all her closest friends. Maybe now she could get into the book she had been trying to read. "Spike," Twilight called a few hours later, finally a good distance into her book. "Can you bring me that book I had yesterday? Mountain Valley's Geographic Guide to Equestria?" Spike, who was sweeping the library, paused from his work and glanced in Twilight's direction. "Didn't you have it with you yesterday?" Twilight looked up from her book, deciding to stare at the ceiling as she tried to think back. "Well, I didn't think, but maybe— no, wait, I did have it. I put it in my saddlebag so I could have it when I read this book at the park, but then I realized that I left this book here." The unicorn began to point her hooves at different spots in the air, mentally retracing her steps. "So I came back, but then Pinkie Pie grabbed me to help decorate for her party, and that took all afternoon. So the book was still in the saddlebags when I went to the party, and then I left the party to come back here, and then I got pony napped, Twilight quickly twisted her head around as her eyes darted about the library. The unicorn jumped to her hooves, galloping around the room in a panic while rummaging through drawers and checking every nook and cranny she could find. Spike ended up being the one to stop Twilight's panic by jumping in front of her when she was trying to turn and gallop in another direction. "Whoa, easy, Twilight. What's wrong?" "My saddlebags! Where are they?" "How should I know?" the baby dragon asked with a shrug. "Oh no! No, 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 no!" Twilight rattled off, shaking her head from side to side. "I had my saddlebags with me when I was pony napped, and that means either those cult ponies took them or I lost them somewhere along the way. No, 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 no! I can replace the copy of Geographic Guide to Equestria, but I had books in that bag Princess Celestia loaned me from the Royal Library. I can't lose those books. No, 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 no!" Spike grabbed the sides of the panicking unicorn's head and brought her eyes to his. "Twilight, breathe and think. Can't you just use your locator spell?" Twilight paused for a moment, but then a smile of relief burst onto her face as she closed her eyes and focused, her horn starting to shimmer and blink. The locator spell was a charm Twilight put on her saddlebags after leaving them in the library one too many times. It would allow her to find her bags based on similar magical principles to the spell Rarity used to find gems. Twilight's spell, however, had a wider range and was more accurate, since it was focused on finding a single magically marked item, namely, her saddlebags. Twilight waved her head around, crossing her eyes as she watched her horn flash at different rates, and finally found the direction where the flashing was the fastest. The spell was pointing to a window, beyond which Twilight could see the Everfree forest. "Great. That's just great. My bags are in the forest," Twilight grumbled. If it was just a normal bag of books, she probably would have left them, considering the dangers involved going into the Everfree forest. Twilight, however, couldn't keep herself from thinking about how Princess Celestia had loaned her some of those books. Even if the Everfree forest was dangerous, disappointing the princess was worse, at least in Twilight's mind. After a few seconds of internal debate, Twilight began to trot towards the door, only for Spike to quickly cut her off. "Nuh-uh. No way, Twi. Princess Celestia would have my scales if she found out I let you go back to the Everfree Forest the day after you were pony napped." "Well then, she just won't find out," Twilight replied, levitating Spike out of the way, only for him to run back into her path. "But what if those crazy ponies are still in the forest? Do you want to get pony napped again?" "Princess Celestia's guards scoured the forest last night with Zukora's help. I doubt that any of those ponies are still there," Twilight rationalized. "Besides, I need to get those books back. They're irreplaceable. And I need you to stay here in case some pony comes and wants to check out a book. This is a library after all, and we can't just close it whenever we want." Spike was not convinced, crossing his arms and eyeing the unicorn. "I still don't like it, Twilight. Can't you find some pony to go with you? Every pony else is busy, especially after they already came by to see me. Besides, I've been to the Everfree Forest, Spike. I know how to keep myself out of trouble." "Says the pony that got turned to stone by a cockatrice," Spike pointed out. Twilight smiled weakly. "I'll admit that wasn't one of my better moments. Still, if I'm not back in 3 hours, then you can tell the princess that I left. You can even say that I put you to sleep with the sedation spell so you couldn't stop me." "Twilight, I don't want you to go because I think it's dangerous, not because I don't want to get in trouble." "Spike, I promise everything will be fine," the unicorn reassured as she walked around Spike and continued towards the door. "Now, just keep doing your chores and I'll be back before you know it." She glanced at the clock. "It's just after 3. So if I'm not back by a little after 6 in the afternoon, then you can tell Princess Celestia. But I promise I'll be back before then." Twilight swallowed nervously, stepping slowly through the forest as she kept her head down, following the light of her blinking horn. The threatening trees of the Everfree Forest surrounded the unicorn, their mangled and twisted branches reaching down from the canopy like deadly claws. The silence of the forest was unnerving, Twilight's ears swiveling constantly to pick up any trace of sound as shivers ran up her spine from both the tension and the chill in the air. Okay, maybe it won't be fine, Twilight muttered to herself, finally admitting that she wasn't completely ready to brave the forest alone. Although the unicorn was almost sure her mind was playing tricks on her, she couldn't help herself from believing every pony-shaped shadow she saw was one of the cult ponies trying to pony nap her again. She even barreled off the forest path a few times, trying to get the jump on a would-be assailant, only to discover it was a bush or tree branch. The situation was made only worse as dark, gray, and threatening clouds rolled in over the forest Everfree's first spring thunderstorm. Twilight could only imagine how horrible it would be to get caught in one of the forest's infamous wild storms, with wind strong enough to pick a pony off her feet and throw her halfway across Equestria, with lightning that. Twilight shook her head, trying to clear away her panicked thoughts. She was getting close to her saddlebags now. The rate at which her horn was flashing was a sure indicator of that. She just needed to get those bags, and then she could teleport herself back to the library. Okay, just hold it together, Twilight. Just hold it together a little longer, the unicorn whispered to herself in a half-hearted pep talk. A pep talk she tried to continue as she rounded a bend in the path, only for its words to die in her mouth as she came to a stop. As she glanced about, her pupils constricted to small dots as her breathing quickened. Her locator spell had led her back to where she had been in the forest the night before, the forest clearing where the spell had been cast, the same place where she had been held captive by the cult ponies. For a moment, Twilight had to fight the overpowering urge to teleport back to the library at that very moment and leave her saddlebags to her fate. That urge, however, subsided when Twilight noticed her horn was blinking faster near the very edge of the clearing. After trotting just outside the clearing and rummaging through a few bushes, Twilight found her saddlebags. The cultists had probably tossed them aside once they finished carrying her to the clearing. Carrying the bag with her magic, Twilight stepped back into the forest clearing. She opened the flaps, breathing a sigh of relief as she checked inside. None of the rare books were missing. In fact, nothing was missing, not even the more common texts she had been carrying. It was a discovery that brought a smile to Twilight's face. She levitated the bags over her head and settled them down on her back. Perfect! Now just to teleport myself back to the library and rustle! Twilight's eyes froze, her eyes narrow as her ears stood erect. Rustle, rustle! She turned her head, focusing on the noise at the source of the noise. It was a single bush, located on the edge of the clearing. Something was moving around inside the foliage just out of sight, rustling the leaves. Almost instantly, Twilight's mind began to jump to the worst-case scenario, much like it had done when Fluttershy had taken Celestia's pet Philomena. It could be a cultist lingering there in the darkness. A cultist ready to jump Twilight, hog-tie her again, and this time when they cut her, they would do something far worse than what felt like a paper cut. They might use a knife, or a dagger, or a sword, or... Twilight shook her head hard. No, she couldn't think like that. The bush was too small to hide a full-grown pony. It was probably just an animal. Yes, it was probably just a rabbit or something. She'd just get a little closer, and the little furry creature would pop out and scamper off, and she could finally breathe. Unless it was a snake. Oh, if it was a snake, she was going to scream. Inching closer to the bush, Twilight made each hoof step as silent as possible, straining her eyes to see into the darkness formed by the leaves. The branches rustled again, but whatever animal was inside had yet to jump free. Flash! Crack-room! Twilight leapt a foot in the air before galloping the exact opposite direction of the bush and diving behind a tree on the far side of the clearing. Her heart was pounding so hard it felt like it could burst out of her chest. Twilight putting a hoof over it to ensure it remained inside her rib cage. She then began breathing deeply, trying to calm down. It was just the storm, Twilight told herself, looking up at the threatening sky above the forest. It was just thunder. It was just thunder. Thunder that scared me half to death, but it was just thunder. As the unicorn tried to calm herself, she began to hear something over the sound of her own breathing. It was soft at first, but as Twilight managed to slow and quiet her breathing, she began to hear the sound more clearly. It was crying. Some pony nearby was crying, and from the sound of the voice, it was a young filly. "Hello?" Twilight called out, her ears swiveling as she tried to pinpoint the sound. "Is some pony there?" The crying quickly fell silent, as if the voice's owner was still trying to hide. Still, Twilight had been able to figure out the general direction the voice was coming from, moving back into the forest clearing as she continued to listen. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you," Twilight called out as she looked around. She, however, heard no voice call back to her. Maybe her imagination really was getting the best of her. Sighing, Twilight began to gather her magic into her horn, preparing to teleport back to the library. Flash! Crack-a-room! Again, the storm caught Twilight by surprise. It wasn't as bad as the first time. Twilight was able to keep herself standing in the center of the clearing instead of galloping off to hide. She did, however, throw an annoyed glare up at the clouds for startling her twice. Still, the thunder had also brought with it another sound. The crying Twilight had heard earlier, and it was close. Deciding it would be better not to try to call out for the pony a second time, Twilight swiveled her ears forward and listened. The crying was now accompanied by some rustling, and it took Twilight only a few moments to pinpoint its source. It was the bush from earlier, the one Twilight had feared hid some horrible danger. More concerned about the other pony than the possibility of being attacked, Twilight crept over to the bush as quietly as possible. As she grew close, the unicorn reached out with her magic and began to carefully grasp at the branches. If whatever was inside the bush decided to run away, Twilight wanted to at least get a good look at it before it escaped. With a nervous swallow, Twilight braced herself. Her magic shoved the branches away, and the unicorn shut her eyes tight, a small part of her still expecting some pony in a cloak to jump out. When that didn't happen, Twilight cracked her eyes open and took a long look at the interior of the bush. What Twilight found, however, was nothing she could have expected. A filly, as young as, or even a little younger than Apple Bloom, was tangled up in the thorny branches. The filly had nicks and scratches all over, caused by the thorns as she struggled to free herself. It looked like she had been there a few hours, if not longer. If it were any normal filly, Twilight would have reached out to help immediately, but the unicorn found herself frozen, mind locking up as she tried to process the filly's appearance. Her coat was a regal black. She possessed a rich purple mane with a luster comparable to Rarity's, despite the fact that its long strands were tangled in the bush's thorny branches. And finally, the filly had not only a pair of Pegasus wings, but a unicorn horn, making her an alicorn. Twilight then looked into the filly's turquoise eyes, which were locked on the young adult unicorn. Those eyes were filled with fear. The filly looked upon Twilight as if she was one of the nasty monsters of the Everfree forest, as if the unicorn would strike out at any moment and devour her. Those fear-filled eyes, however, were not shaped like a normal pony's. The turquoise orbs, which should have had round pupils, instead resembled a dragon's eyes, with dagger-shaped pupils. The whites of her eyes were also off. Instead of being white, they were a lighter color that closely resembled the color of the irises. Above all, they were eyes Twilight had seen before. They were the eyes of Nightmare Moon. Twilight felt her breathing again as her memories slipped back to the night before. The cult said they were the servants of Nightmare Moon, and they were obviously trying to cast some kind of spell. She might not have She might not have gotten a great look at the clearing the night before, but she did see arcane lines, bowls filled with powders, and the spell they were attempting. It wasn't some simple bit of magic. To need that much setup, the spell had to be powerful. Possibly the most powerful spell Twilight had ever seen. On top of that, they said they were servants of Nightmare Moon. Yet there was more to it than that. When they started to cast the spell, Twilight could feel it in her horn. The air became saturated with arcane energy, and as the spell began to progress, the magic began to change, to feel familiar. It was a kind of magic she hadn't felt since... Twilight's pupils narrowed into fine points from the horror of the idea she had formulated. What if the spell cast was supposed to bring back Nightmare Moon? And what if it worked? It was insane. It was something that shouldn't be possible. Yet, how else could she have felt such strong aura of magic in the air? Why else would a filly she had never seen before, and an alicorn with such strong resemblance to the infamous mare in the moon, be in the same clearing? Was that their goal? To resurrect Nightmare Moon? Did it work? Had the cult succeeded in bringing back Nightmare Moon? Was this Nightmare Moon? It had to be. There wasn't any other explanation for the intensity of the spell nor the appearance of the filly. That crazy cult had actually brought back Nightmare Moon, and she had to warn Symphonie, tell Symphonie. She had to write to Princess Celestia immediately. Or better yet, she had to confront this thing before it could get away and hurt Symphonie. Even if she were the size of a filly, Nightmare Moon was a master of deception. As far as Twilight knew, this was all a trick. The alicorn could have simply been attempting to lure Symphonie into a trap, lying in wait for Symphonie to get close before attacking. Twilight bristled, furrowing her eyebrows as she glared at the filly. "I know," Twilight began harshly, only to stop abruptly. With just those 2 words, the filly shrank away whimpering, shutting her eyes as the bush's thorns left fresh cuts and scrapes on her body. When the filly finally dared to open her eyes again, Twilight lifted her hoof and reached out as slowly as possible. Still, the result was the same. The filly shied away, whimpered, trembled, and succeeded in injuring herself further on the bush's thorns. It was a reaction of pure fear. Twilight's brain did a flip-flop trying to process this. Nightmare Moon was one of the greatest threats Equestria had ever faced. She was a monster that tried to, at best, scare Twilight and her new friends away, and, at worst, get them killed. She was supposed to be the worst part of Luna's psyche brought to life. At least, that's what Twilight thought. That's what Twilight thought the insane cult spell was supposed to do. And here she was, just a filly, tangled in a thorn bush. And Twilight was unable to look away. Those dragon eyes that once looked down on all ponies, as if they were nothing but lowly insects, was now filled to the brim with fear and pain. Some of the scratches from the bush's thorns were bleeding. The filly was terrified and hurt, and she needed help. It's okay," Twilight soothed shakily. "I won't hurt you." The unicorn wasn't sure at all of what she was doing, but she had, at the very least, to get the little filly out of the bush so she couldn't receive any more injuries. Taking hold of the bush magically, Twilight began carefully snapping away branches piece by piece. There were a couple times the filly winced, any small movement leading to a thorn pricking her, but still she kept her eyes locked on Twilight. The filly's eyes were filled with fear, but behind that fear was a flicker of hope. Hope that the unicorn who had appeared was not a monster. A few minutes later, with a final snap, enough branches were cleared away for Twilight to gently levitate the filly out of the bush. She brought the filly Nightmare Moon out from the edge of the clearing. Setting her down in the center where the pair proceeded to stare at each other. Twilight's mind was spinning at 1,000,000 miles per hour while not going anywhere, cycling through the same thoughts over and over and over again. Was this really Nightmare Moon? Was that the purpose of the spell last night? Did it work? How did it work? How could there be a Nightmare Moon without Luna? Weren't they one and the same? Why was Nightmare Moon so small? Did the spell not work? Was Nightmare Moon just trying to trick her into taking her back to Ponyville? Was she only pretending to be so small and helpless? Was she dangerous? Was this really Nightmare Moon? Round and round the thought circled, Twilight unable to stop herself. It was the thunderstorm that finally managed to break the endless loop. Another crack of thunder cut through the air and snapped Twilight back to reality. And just as quickly, the unicorn noticed the filly had rushed up to her. Trembling like a leaf, the filly clung to Twilight's leg, eyes shut tight. She was scared of the thunderstorm. Would Nightmare Moon ever be scared of a thunderstorm? Could she just be playing a trick, trying to lull the unicorn into a false sense of security? Twilight couldn't be sure. Her mind was telling her that the filly couldn't be trusted, that she should just leave it in the forest, tell Princess Celestia, and let the princess deal with it. At the same time, if the filly was Nightmare Moon, Twilight couldn't just leave her in the forest. If she did, there was a chance that the filly would disappear. No. If the filly was a danger to Equestria, Twilight had to keep track of her, if only to make sure that she couldn't hurt any pony. That, and Twilight couldn't deny it didn't feel right to leave any pony alone in the dangerous forest. Would you like to come back to Ponyville with me? Twilight asked, unable to think of a better way to try and ask the filly to come along willingly. The little pony remained silent. Her eyes spoke a reply. She shakily nodded, clinging even closer to Twilight as the filly now looked upon the unicorn like she was the grand savior from a storybook. Twilight might have smiled at this sight if it weren't for the few raindrops starting to fall on her head. "Oh, great," Twilight muttered, flinching a bit as the rain started to get thicker. The storm wasn't going to break up anytime soon, and she couldn't teleport back to the library with the filly. She wasn't very good with multi-pony teleportation spells. The one time she had been able to pull it off, both she and her passenger had ended up pretty badly singed. That was the last thing the filly needed after being stuck in the thorny bush. So, Twilight did the only thing she could. Horn aglow, she picked up the filly and nestled her down on her back between her saddlebags. Twilight then turned her magic above her head, projecting a transparent barrier just in time to shield them from the worsening rain. It would be a long, muddy walk back out of the forest. At the moment, however, Twilight just hoped she could get back to the forest back to the library before Spike panicked and sent a letter to the princess. Spike anxiously finished writing the letter to the princess, glancing at the clock as each minute ticked by. Twilight had been gone for 2 hours and 59 minutes. Twilight had 1 minute, just 1 minute, to get back to the library before I notified Celestia. There wasn't a second hoof on the clock, but Spike still watched it anxiously, rolling the scroll as he prepared to set it on fire. The baby dragon glanced outside at the raging thunderstorm. Rainbow Dash had come by the library earlier to warn that Ponyville weather team was letting a storm from the Everfree forest roll over Ponyville. The storm wasn't scheduled, but the weather team had just decided to let it pass over to save themselves the trouble of preparing a storm just 2 days later. It made sense, but the storm was still pretty nasty. Thunder, lightning, wind, and pounding rain all came closer, and Twilight was out in the storm. Possibly heard her pony napped. Spike glanced at the clock again, seeing the minute hoof click to the next slot. It was official. It had been 3 hours, and Twilight hadn't returned. Spike began to breathe in the message to Celestia mere moments from being sent magically to the Canterlot when the doors suddenly swung open. "Spike, don't you dare breathe out!" Twilight yelled, pointing a commanding hoof at the baby dragon. She had mud and grime up to her neck, little leaves and sticks caught in her mane, and a tired expression on her face. Still, Spike couldn't help but smile, tossing the carefully prepared note aside before running up to Twilight. "Where were you?" Spike asked in a combination of worry and relief. He would have hugged the unicorn's leg, but he noticed how muddy she was. "In the Everfree forest, like I told you. It just took longer to find my saddlebags than I expected, and then I had to walk back in the storm," Twilight explained, doing her best to wipe her hooves clean on the welcome mat before stepping inside. Are you okay? Yes, I'm fine. Nothing happened unless you count the storm. All I need is a bath and some dinner, the unicorn answered, her horn glowing as she opened her saddlebags and removed the thankfully dry books, though the bags themselves were damp and splattered with mud. Well, then you go upstairs and take a bath. I'll make dinner. How about some soup and sandwiches? Can you make it celery soup and daffodil sandwiches? Twilight asked with a weak smile. Of course. One order of celery soup and daffodil sandwiches coming right up. After I get these books put away, Spike offered as he gathered the retrieved books, beginning the quick task of putting the more common tomes away on the library shelves. While the baby dragon went about his work, Twilight headed to the second floor of the library, crossing her bedroom and entering the bathroom. It was a small, cozy room with a bathtub that doubled as a shower and all the basic amenities. Nothing fancy, but it would get the job done. Twilight slipped into the bathroom before she shut and locked the door, breathing a sigh of relief before looking over her shoulder. Still lying on her back, nestled between her saddlebags, was the filly Nightmare Moon. She had curled up and fallen asleep halfway back to the library, and thankfully, Spike hadn't noticed the breathing black mass that was partially hidden by Twilight's mane and saddlebags. For the moment, Twilight just let the filly sleep, turning on the bathtub faucets. As the tub started to fill with hot water, the unicorn opened the medicine cabinet, gathering first aid supplies. While most of the injuries the filly had from the thorny bush were tiny, there were a few Twilight wanted to bandage. Twilight waited until the tub was almost full before shutting off the faucets, the perfectly warm water gently steaming in the cool bathroom air. At this point, Twilight turned her head back, lowering as she gently nudged the filly Nightmare Moon with her nose. It took a few nudges, but the little black-coated pony began to wake up. The filly looked about the room, taking in her surroundings before looking at Twilight, who offered a gentle smile. Don't worry, you're safe here. This is where I live, and you won't have to worry about the storm or anything here. Still, after walking around in that storm, I need to get cleaned up. Would you mind getting off my back while I take a quick bath? The filly shook her head once, very carefully and cautiously getting to her hooves before jumping off of Twilight's back, using her wings to slow her descent. When her hooves were on the floor, the filly laid right back down on the soft bathroom mat, curling back up into a tiny, black-coated ball. Twilight found this behavior a little bit strange, but she guessed that the filly was tired and wanted to go back to sleep. The unicorn was now able to levitate her mud-splattered saddlebags off her back and climb into the bathtub, the warm water feeling wonderful as she used a brush to get clean. She intended it to be a quick bath, more worried about getting clean than enjoying the water. Once the mud was gone and all the little sticks and leaves were out of her mane, Twilight climbed out and toweled herself off while she let the tub drain. When the dirty water was gone, she began filling the tub again, this time only a quarter of the way full. It was a very shallow bath, perfect for the small filly. Twilight was able to levitate the miniature Nightmare Moon look-alike into the water, the little pony offering no protest but a few winces as the warm water came into contact with her scratches. Twilight then used a brush, cleaning some of the mud that had managed to splatter up onto the filly, despite riding the whole way to the library on Twilight's back. With the filly clean, Twilight lifted her out of the tub, toweled her off, and used the first aid kit to bandage the worst of her cuts and scrapes. All the while, the unicorn was amazed with how cooperative the filly was, despite acting sad and tired. Would Nightmare Moon really allow herself to be bathed and bandaged without protest? Sure, such a regal pony might expect to be waited on by servants, but that wasn't what Twilight was doing. She was treating her like a foal. Then the real Nightmare Moon wouldn't accept being treated like a foal, no matter how small or young she actually was. Again, the question of whether this filly really was Nightmare Moon rose up in Twilight's head. She was becoming less and less sure. The resemblance was undeniable. If the little pony had a flowing, magical, star-dotted mane and tail, then she'd look exactly like the mare on the moon. Besides the issue of age and hair, the filly wasn't acting like Nightmare Moon. At least in Twilight's opinion. She didn't talk down to Twilight, nor did she threaten her. She hadn't even said anything yet, and the silence was even stranger. And if she didn't act like Nightmare Moon, that raised another question. If she wasn't Nightmare Moon, then who was she? Twilight couldn't focus too much on that train of thought, a knock coming at the bathroom door as she was putting the last bandage on the filly. "Hey, Twilight, I've got your dinner." "Thank you, Spike," Twilight replied, glancing back at the door to make sure the baby dragon wasn't coming inside. "But you know, I'm really hungry after hiking through the Everfree Forest and Storm. Would you mind making me another sandwich and bowl of soup?" "No problem," the dragon proudly assured from the other side of the door. "I made a big batch of the celery soup, and we have plenty of stuff for sandwiches. I could probably make 5 servings of this meal." "That's wonderful, Spike, but I only need one more." "You got it, Twi," Spike replied as he departed. Twilight listened for her assistant's footsteps to reach the bottom of the stairs before she opened the door. She checked the bedroom, making sure Spike had really left before she stepped out. The filly followed, staying close to Twilight as they crossed the room and moved towards the bed. The meal Spike had brought in was sitting on her bedside table. It looked good, and the unicorn was starving. But instead of digging in herself, she levitated the filly up onto her bed and set the food right in front of her. "Here, you go ahead and eat this. I'm going to go downstairs and talk with Spike," Twilight said, her eyes coming with a comforting smile. The filly again didn't offer much more than a simple nod in reply. She then leaned forward and taking a bite from the sandwich, a bite that was quickly followed by another, and another, and another, the filly eagerly devouring the food. It was the first real sign of life Twilight had seen from the Nightmare Moon look-alike, and it was encouraging to say the least. For now, however, the unicorn had to leave the filly alone to her meal. She had to go downstairs and tell Spike the truth before the baby dragon discovered the filly for himself, assumed the worst, and sent a letter to Celestia. It had taken a couple hours to convince Spike not to write to Celestia about the filly. He, like Twilight at first, had assumed that she was Nightmare Moon reborn, and then Celestia had to be told. He had even written up a letter and was about to send it before Twilight snatched it away and threw it in the garbage. Twilight's arguments were weak. All she could really say is that the filly didn't seem to act like Nightmare Moon. In her logical mind, Twilight knew that Spike was probably right. They needed to tell the princess, but once again the unicorn's imagination began to betray her. Celestia had banished Nightmare Moon to the moon for 1,000 years. Twilight feared she would do the same to the little pony, and that just didn't feel like something the filly deserved. In the end, Twilight only got Spike to agree to the silence by promising she'd go buy him a large sapphire from Rarity as a bribe. It wasn't how she wanted to obtain his silence, but Spike had Pinkie Pie promised that if she got him the gem in the morning, he would keep quiet about the filly until she wanted to tell Princess Celestia. Having eaten her own dinner during the negotiations, Twilight made her way back up to the bedroom. She was a little worried about what she would find. There was a chance that, in the past 2 hours, the filly had grown into an adult Nightmare Moon and was ready to attack. Yet, after she opened the bedroom door, Twilight saw that the filly was sitting on the bed, the sandwich and soup eaten. Taking a moment to steady herself, Twilight approached the filly. Again, she found herself torn on just how she was supposed to act. Nightmare Moon could and had tried to plunge Equestria into eternal night, but the filly didn't seem like a danger. She could have consulted Princess Celestia already, but she just wasn't sure enough. It was a stalemated war between her fear of what the filly could do and fear of what Celestia would do if she found out. She wasn't convinced enough to tell the princess, but she couldn't let her guard down either. If she did, there was a chance the filly would show her true colors, transform into Nightmare Moon, and attack. It was better to be safe than sorry, Twilight choosing to keep her guard up. She'd watch and be ready to bolt out of the room if things became dangerous. At the moment, however, she needed to find out more about the filly. She needed to see if she remembered being Nightmare Moon or maybe had other memories, something to prove who she was. Are you feeling better? The filly nodded only once, barely meeting the unicorn's eyes. That's good, Twilight replied, sitting down beside the bed. So, do you know where you are? Do you remember where you were before I found you? The filly shook her head, the first of many such replies, as Twilight began a longer chain of questions, asking the filly what she did remember, what she knew, and other such things. There were a few nods here and there, but most of the questions were met with a shake of the filly's head, her eyes slowly tearing up. Upon the last question, when Twilight asked the filly if she remembered her name, the little black pony broke down and began crying. It wasn't wailing or outright sobbing, but a quiet cry, the filly sniffling as tears poured down her cheeks. Twilight now began to understand why the little pony had been so quiet and subdued. She was scared and confused. The only memories she seemed to have were ones of the past several hours. She had no memories of her own, yet possessed some common knowledge, like an understanding of the equestrian language. Twilight found it difficult to even imagine having so few memories. It did, however, support Twilight's theory that this little filly had been produced by the spell cast by the cult. It would make sense for her to only have a few hours of memory, as the spell had only been cast by the night before. Again, the question of whether or not the filly was really Nightmare Moon reared its ugly head. The spell's purpose was to recreate Nightmare Moon, and it was working until Princess Celestia and the royal guard intervened. The spell was interrupted, meaning the filly was a product of an incomplete spell, and there was often no way to predict what effect an incomplete spell would have. It was a question Twilight chose to shelve in her mind for later, mostly because the filly was still crying. It was a sight that pulled at her heartstrings, putting her at war with herself. Twilight had every desire to keep her guard up in case the filly was truly dangerous, but, at the same time, she couldn't in good conscience ignore how scared the filly was. So, despite her own anxieties, Twilight crawled up in bed and lay down beside the young alicorn, doing her best to comfort her while the little black pony continued to cry, letting out the pent-up fear and anxiety that had been building inside her for the past several hours. It took about a half an hour for the filly to finally calm down, crying herself dry. The tears, however, seemed to have a good effect for the filly. She looked less scared than she had been. She lay right next to Twilight, with her head leaned against the unicorn's shoulder as she tried to dry her eyes. Feeling better? Yes, the filly shakily answered, the first word Twilight heard her say the entire night. The voice had a musical quality. It reminded Twilight of the time she had seen an earth pony playing crystal juice glasses filled with water, a glass harp. It was a feat made easier by the special horseshoes the pony had on, but it was still impressive to watch and listen to. A voice like a glass harp. Certainly not the voice of an evil, fallen princess bent on creating eternal night. That's good, Twilight replied, falling silent for a time as she struggled to find something to say. Yet when nothing came to mind, Twilight glanced at the clock and noticed the late hour. So, it's been a long day. How about we get some sleep? Can I sleep here? The filly asked as she looked at Twilight, which drew up a fresh moment of tension in Twilight's mind. Letting the filly sleep in the same bed was asking for trouble. If she was Nightmare Moon and just playing some cruel trick, she would have every opportunity to attack Twilight in the middle of the night. At the same time, Twilight couldn't bring herself to say no. It was like her mouth had forgotten how to form the word no in the face of the filly's pleading eyes. Yes, you can. But how about I make it so we're both more comfortable? With that, the unicorn's horn lit up as she shifted a few blankets and pillows around. Within a few moments, Twilight was under the covers of her bed, while the filly lay comfortably on top, next to Twilight, with her own blanket and pillow. Soon, both Twilight and the filly were stifling yawns as the long day had taken its toll on them. It was still relatively early, barely getting close to 9 o'clock, but Twilight was more than willing to call it a night. Another yawn gripped the unicorn as her eyes started to droop a little. Miss Unicorn? Twilight was drawn back from the edge of sleep as she lifted her head, eyes meeting the filly's. I'm sorry, I never introduced myself. My name's Twilight Sparkle. Okay, Miss Sparkle, can I ask you something? Yes? Do you want me to leave in the morning? The filly asked as she snuggled into Twilight's side, fearing her answer. What makes you think I'd want you to leave? The filly bit her lip for a second before continuing. You were mad when you first saw me. I just didn't think you'd want me around. It's not your fault. I just thought you were some pony else for a while, Twilight assured. But no, I don't want you to leave in the morning. The filly smiled at this, the first honest smile she gave all evening. With that concern put to rest, the filly yawned and closed her eyes. Within minutes she drifted off to sleep, Twilight following soon after.